Welcome to MCN. We're in Lisbon, Portugal, testing the new Honda CB125R. So we're back now from a rain-soaked Lisbon in Portugal, where we were riding Honda's new CB125R naked bike. So the Honda's actually really good fun, and you know, it handles really nicely. It's nice and plush, and it's nice and forgiving for a learner rider. So up front, you've got a 41mm upside down forks, which are actually the same size as the ones found on Honda's much larger XADV adventure scooter. At the back, you've also got an unadjustable shock, and both are appropriately damp. They're not too hard and they're not too soft. And we actually spent all day riding these bikes on pothole-laden, cobbled streets, rain-soaked streets around Lisbon, and the bike actually behaved really nicely. It didn't get out of shape once. That would really help new riders who are entering motorcycling for the first time. Switchgear wise, the Honda again is really impressive. Everything is logically placed. You've got indicators where you'd expect them to be, horn, everything else is, it's logically placed. Up front, you've got a nice LCD dash, which is something that you'd expect to find on their larger Fireblades or new CB1000R, and not on a new 125 for the commuter and beginner market. It's a really nice feature. It's got everything you'd want. There's MPG, there's a fuel gauge, there's an easy to read speedometer and rev counter, easily adjustable, and there's everything that you'd ever want. So as far as I'm aware, you cannot connect your phone to this, which is something that perhaps puts it behind KTM's 125 Duke, which I believe you can connect your phone to rather easily. Then again, I'm not sure if that is a feature worth having. You know, I personally ride motorbikes to get away from people and to escape having to speak to people on the phone and send text messages and things like that. So the idea of connecting my bike to my phone doesn't really appeal to me anyway. So I don't think it's that much of a loss that it hasn't got it. So the CB125R is actually really comfortable. You know, we rode the bike around the city, but we also took it out to play in the mountains as well. We spent a full day on it, probably around 120 miles, and there's plenty of padding in the seat. My only gripe with it would be that the seat's actually quite high. So the seat height on this bike is 816 mils, which is okay for me. I'm 5'6", but I was on my tiptoes, you know, so anyone shorter than me would really struggle, and I think that would really hinder new riders who want that confidence-inspiring flat foot on their first bike. That said, because the bike only weighs just a fraction under 130 kilos, it's actually the lightest in class. It is still easy to manoeuvre, and you know, it's not that intimidating if you have to use just one foot, but it is still going to be a hindrance to some people. So this bike costs an impressive £3,949, and I think that's very reasonable for what you get. And it actually places it really nicely amongst its rivals as well. So this bike is the second cheapest in class, behind Suzuki's slightly lesser spec GSX-S 125. And then above that, you've got perhaps the more premium KTM, Aprilia, and also Yamaha's MT 125. But that said, the Honda is just as equally spec'd as those bikes above it, if missing only a few features such as the phone connectivity of the KTM Duke. So as well as tackling urban streets and also Nadgery back roads in the mountains, we also did a number of open roads on this bike. And even though it only produces 13.1 brake horsepower from its single-cylinder engine, it's actually really impressive. We did a number of coastal roads, and the bike behaved really nicely. We also covered a number of motorway miles, and it also sits at 70 miles per hour, nice and comfortably, with revs to spare, which means that should you have to cover a few motorway miles on your commute, it would be perfectly adequate. So as well as being appropriately damped from those 41mm upside down forks, they're actually the same forks that will be used in Honda's new CB300R, which will be launched later this year. As well as that, you also get the same frame as the CB300R. And that's great because it gives the bike a genuine big bike presence. It feels wide, it feels purposeful, and it feels a lot bigger than a 125 ought to be. And that gives you, road presence as well. And it stops cars from bullying you. You don't feel intimidated when you're riding it, and that makes things like filtering to the front of traffic easier because you feel like you should be there, and it makes just everyday life less of a hassle and easier to get on with. So although we didn't get to test it, Honda claim a near 300-mile tank range for this bike. So in search of drier conditions, we actually headed out of Lisbon and towards Portugal's luscious coastal roads, and we actually managed to find some dry patches of tarmac, which was great. And again, the CB125R really impressed. It felt planted, it felt stable, it was able to ride at the higher speeds commanded on more open roads. So unfortunately, my time with the CB125R wasn't all without fault. I did have, on a couple of occasions, problems with the gearbox, and it refused to click from neutral into first gear, which was more frustrating than anything. But if you filter to the front of the traffic, knock it into neutral, and then as soon as the traffic lights go orange and you want to click into first, you're just left stranded there with the cars rushing back past you, which is really going to hamper your confidence as a new rider. So Honda have actually given the CB125R a 4-piston radial caliper up front. This is great, it gives a real air of quality, perhaps missed out by other bikes in this class. Unfortunately, it does feel a bit vague and progressive, and it lacks that initial bite that learners really crave and really need when they're first starting out riding a motorbike. You really have to yank hard on it to bring it up to a stop. And when we were out in the mountains, I found myself using the rear brake quite excessively just to bring it up to a stop. So I had to use the rear brake and front brake in tandem a lot of the time because the front brake feels quite vague on this bike and it just lets it down ever so slightly.